Walter Greer pointed a finger at the rusted hulk sitting in the hedgerow like a judge handing down a final sentence. There was no ceremony or long explanation involved in the moment, just his arm extended and 7 words spoken flat into the quiet morning air. "Fix my grandfather's harvester, and I'll sign the deed over to you." By the time those words were said, 3 professional mechanics had already tried and failed to bring the machine back to life. The first man condemned the whole thing in a single afternoon, while the second one cracked a fuel fitting and walked off the property without even saying goodbye. When the third man arrived, he brought a computer that found nothing it could talk to, and he actually laughed on his way back to his truck. Now a 23-year-old farmhand with grease under his fingernails and no real credentials was supposed to do what the experts couldn't. The real question here isn't whether he managed to fix the machine, but rather what he understood about that iron that the others simply didn't. The Greer farm covers 380 acres in Montgomery County, Indiana, and if you happened to drive past it on the county road back in the fall of 1987, you probably would have thought the place was doing just fine. The corn rows ran straight as an arrow, the soybean fields held their deep color late into October, and the fences were all still standing. But standing and sound are 2 very different things. And a man who truly knows land can read the difference between a working farm and one that is just holding on. Fewer acres were being worked each year than the year before, and the equipment sitting in the yard was much older than it should have been for an operation of that size. Instead of replacing fence posts that had rotted out, someone was just driving in shims to keep them upright. The farm wasn't exactly failing, but it was slowly being let go, which is how a man lets go of things when he stops planning for a future he won't be around to see. Walter Greer was 71 years old and had been running that ground by himself since his wife passed away in 1979. He never talked about her or much of anything else, but he did walk the fence line every morning before breakfast to check on the property. He would touch the posts and check the wire while reading the soil at the corners of each field, much like a doctor examines a patient he has known for decades. He talked to the land more than he ever talked to people, because the land always gave him an honest answer. Eli Cutter had shown up 6 months earlier looking for seasonal work, a 23-year-old from nowhere in particular with a background that was pretty simple. He grew up around heavy equipment and knew how things fit together, and more importantly, he was willing to work hard. Walter hired him for the fall harvest and fully expected him to move on once the work was done. But Eli never left. He found plenty of reasons to stay through the winter by fixing fences and cutting firewood, and by the time spring rolled around, he had become something the farm hadn't seen in years. He was someone who actually gave a damn about the place, though he never said it out loud, and just kept showing up every morning. The 1971 International Harvester 1460 sat at the far end of the property in a hedgerow where blackberry vines and wild roses had spent 22 years eating through the frame. The cab windows were so thick with grime you couldn't see through them, and the original red paint had faded into a color that looked more like dried clay. The feeder house chains had rusted into solid blocks of iron, and thick vines had grown completely through the auger housing. Walter walked past that machine every single morning on his route, but he never looked directly at it. In the 6 months Eli had been watching him, Walter Greer never once looked at that harvester head-on. Instead, glancing toward it the way you look at something you're afraid to see clearly. Nobody on the farm ever talked about the machine, and Eli was the kind of man who noticed that silence. Everything started with a single hydraulic line. The combine Walter used for the heavy lifting was a 1979 Case 1480 that he kept running more out of pure stubbornness than anything else. But it blew a high-pressure line during the pre-harvest prep in late August. This wasn't just a slow drip or a minor leak. It was a total failure that sprayed fluid across the entire engine bay and caused the header to drop right in the middle of a lift. Walter called the dealer over in Crawfordsville that same afternoon, and they told him it would be a 2-week wait and a $4,000 bill before they even turned a wrench on it. He hung up the phone and stood there in the kitchen for a long time without saying a word. When you are staring down harvest season, 2 weeks isn't just 14 days on a calendar. It is the whole season. Eli had been across the yard and heard the line blow when it happened. He walked over to the machine and looked at the mess without touching a thing, then told Walter he thought he could get it fixed. Walter just looked at him and said he was hired as a hand rather than a mechanic, then told him to get back to pulling fence staples on the east side of the property. Eli did what he was told and went to work. But he came back an hour later carrying a compression fitting he'd salvaged off a dead cylinder in the scrap pile and a length of old hose he'd found in the shed. He had a look on his face that wasn't exactly cocky, but he looked certain that the math was right and the rest was just a matter of putting in the time.
Walter didn't say anything. He just watched the whole process from the barn door.
3 hours later, the new line held under full pressure and the header lifted up smooth and clean, leaving Eli to wipe his greasy hands on a rag that was already too far gone to save. Walter still didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked back to the house, and Eli figured that was probably the end of the conversation. That evening, after they finished supper, Walter walked out to the bunkhouse and told Eli to come take a walk with him. He didn't lead him toward the case or any of the equipment they actually used to run the farm. He walked straight to the hedgerow, where the 1460 sat in the dark, with nothing but the yard light casting long shadows through the tangled vines. Walter stopped right in front of the old machine and looked it square in the eye for what Eli guessed was the first time in a lot of years. His jaw was set tight, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets.
Then he laid it out. He told Eli to fix the harvester, and if he did, he would get the deed to the North 40. Those were the only terms he offered, and he said it without any fanfare, which was the same way he handled every other piece of business on the place. Eli stood there stunned and asked him why. He wanted to know why this specific machine mattered so much, why Walter was making a wager like that, and why he was picking him to do it. Walter looked at him and said that 3 men with diplomas had already failed to get it running, and he wanted to see if Eli was the kind of man who could actually do the job. The North 40 is 80 acres of prime bottom ground on the north edge of the farm, and it has the kind of dark soil and perfect drainage that people dream about. Land like that doesn't just come up for sale in Montgomery County, because the families who own it tend to hold on to it for generations. If you looked at what that ground would cost at market price,
it was more money than Eli would make in 10 years of farm wages, and maybe even 20. He said yes before he really had a chance to think about the reality of the situation. The words were out of his mouth and hanging in the air before the full weight of the agreement had even finished settling on his shoulders. Walter saw it happen. His face didn't really change, but something in his eyes shifted, the way the light changes when a cloud moves off the sun, which wasn't dramatic but was definitely different. He gave a single short nod, turned on his heel, and started walking back toward the house. Eli was left standing there in the dark next to 6,000 pounds of rusted iron, while the crickets in the hedgerow made a wall of noise around him. He had just committed himself to a project that 3 professionals had already told Walter was a total impossibility. He didn't have a real plan or any fancy credentials to his name. All he had was a compression fitting, a piece of scrap hose, and the knowledge that those 2 things had worked for him once before. He stood there in the weeds and started trying to figure out what his first move was going to be. Eli spent the entire first morning out at the machine doing nothing but observing. He walked all the way around the perimeter of the harvester the same way Walter walked a fence line, moving slow and deliberate with his hands at his sides. He didn't touch a thing yet because he was busy reading the story of the machine. Blackberry canes had grown up through the platform auger and poked out through a gap in the cab door seal, and wild rose bushes had taken root against the left rear tire. That tire had gone flat years ago, and the rubber had eventually vulcanized itself to the metal rim after 22 Indiana summers in the sun. Rust was flaking off the body everywhere in shades of orange and brown, but Eli knew how to tell the difference between rust that just looked ugly and rust that actually meant the metal was dead.
Surface patina on sheet metal is mostly just a cosmetic issue that looks worse than it is. What a man really has to look for is deep pitting that goes all the way through the steel and turns a solid edge into something soft enough to push a thumbnail through. The body of the 1460 had the first kind of rust, so it looked terrible, but it wasn't structurally gone. Then he pulled a thick vine away from the engine access panel so he could look at the cylinder walls through the glow plug ports, and that was when the situation got a lot more difficult. The rust he found down in the guts of the engine was the second kind. He took a minute to think about the three men who had tried this before him and what they must have seen when they stood in this same spot.
Walter had told him the history of those failures the night they made the wager, and he told it in a flat way that made it sound like he'd repeated the story so many times the emotion had been bled out of it. The first mechanic came out from the International Harvester dealer back in 1978, which was only 3 years after the machine had been parked in the hedgerow. He spent a single afternoon looking it over before he declared the engine was seized up too tight to save and gave Walter a quote for a rebuild that cost more than the entire budget for the fall harvest. When Walter told him he needed some time to think about that kind of money, the mechanic assumed it was a no and never bothered to show up again. The second man showed up in 1983. And he was an independent mechanic from over in Danville who had a big reputation for being able to fix old iron. He actually managed to make some real progress on the machine, and freed the engine up just enough that you could feel the crankshaft wasn't completely locked in place anymore. But he started forcing things before the penetrating oil had a chance to do the real work, and he ended up cracking a fuel line fitting because he tried to muscle a connection that wasn't ready to move yet. He packed up his tools and left without finishing the job or saying much of anything, and Walter figured the man was just too embarrassed to admit he'd broken it. The third guy came out in 1986 because the dealer sent him over as a personal favor to Walter. He was a lot younger than the first two men, and he carried a diagnostic computer in a gray plastic case like it was some kind of holy relic that held the answer to every problem on the farm. He tried to plug it in, but found absolutely nothing for the computer to talk to. Mostly because a 1971 Harvester doesn't have any sensors or data ports for a computer from 1986 to read. He told Walter the machine wasn't worth the labor it would take to fix it, and he said it in a pleasant way, though that didn't make the news any easier to hear. Eli stood there in the dirt and realized that all three of those men had one big thing in common. The first guy only saw a dollar sign. The second guy didn't have any patience. And the third guy wanted the machine to speak a language it was never built to speak. When the harvester wouldn't cooperate with his technology, he decided the machine itself was the problem. None of those men had bothered to go looking for the original shop manual. Eli found the book on his second trip around the cab, tucked away behind the operator's seat in a canvas sleeve that had rotted out on one side. Rain and snow had clearly reached it over the years because the cover was badly warped and the first dozen pages had fused into a solid block of paper. But once he got past page 14, the rest of the manual was still perfectly readable. All the original diagrams were still there. The torque specs were listed clearly, and he could still see the entire procedure for setting the fuel timing. Right there on the inside of the front cover, someone had written a name in handwriting that was pressed so hard into the paper you could feel it on the other side. It said, Harold Greer, 1971, written with a ballpoint pen that had clearly been running out of ink. That manual told Eli exactly how the machine had been put together back at the factory. What it didn't tell him was the one thing he really needed to know, which was exactly why the machine had stopped running in the first place. He started with the glow plugs, taking all 6 out one at a time with a deep socket and the kind of patience you only get when you know that stripping a plug in a seized head turns a hard problem into a total disaster. Once those ports were open, he mixed up his own penetrating oil using half automatic transmission fluid and half acetone in a clean paint can he'd found in Walter's shop, and he poured that mixture into each cylinder until the fluid sat level with the threads. The ATF was there for lubrication, while the acetone acted as a carrier to pull it past the rust, a trick he'd learned from a retired co-op mechanic who swore by the stuff like it was gospel. They'd stood in a gravel parking lot outside Waveland 3 years back, talking about an old Ford 8N that everyone else had given up on, and that old-timers' advice was what Eli was banking on now. He covered every port with a strip of rag to keep the dirt out, tore a piece of masking tape off a roll to write Day 1 on it with a marker, and pressed it firmly against the fender before walking away. Waiting is its own kind of work, so he filled the empty hours by diving into the hydraulic system to see what else the years had ruined. The fluid that drained out of the reservoir when he cracked the plug was the color of old molasses and moved just as slow, carrying a thick smell that hit the back of his throat before he could even process the color. 22 years of oxidation had turned that hydraulic oil into something closer to varnish, and it had coated every single surface it ever touched inside those lines. He drained the system completely and spent the next 2 days going through it piece by piece, finding that the pump housing looked intact, which was the one bit of luck the whole job really needed to move forward. Every seal in the system had hardened past the point of being useful, 14 of them in total, and they'd gone brittle the way rubber does when it's been through too many heat cycles without being replaced. He ordered the new parts from a specialty supplier in Illinois that still kept IH components on the shelf, paid the extra money to have them shipped fast, and kept working around the hydraulics while he waited for the mail. The electrical system was enough to keep his hands busy, because the 1460 ran on a point and condenser ignition, with no modules or sensors or computers to worry about. What it actually needed was a man willing to go through 22 feet of wiring by hand, section by section, because the insulation had cracked along the main harness and left bare copper exposed in a dozen different spots. He used the wiring diagrams from the manual and worked methodically from the battery forward, replacing anything that looked compromised and cleaning every terminal down to bare metal before he hooked it back up. The corroded battery terminals were too far gone and had to be replaced entirely, and he pulled the points and condenser to measure them before swapping in new ones he'd sourced from that same Illinois supplier. Walter started appearing every evening right around dusk, standing at the edge of the hedgerow without ever stepping inside it, and he'd watch for 10 or 15 minutes without saying a single word. Eli figured out the old man's system by the 3rd day, noticing that if Walter stopped closer than the first blackberry cane, it meant he was actually interested in what he was seeing. If he stayed back past the wild rose on the south side, it meant he had his doubts, and for the first 2 evenings, he stayed well back in the shadows. On the 3rd evening, he finally moved up to that cane line and stood there for 20 minutes while Eli kept his head down and kept working, because acknowledging the man would have probably ended the moment. On the 4th day, he finally tried the crankshaft. He fitted a breaker bar to the front pulley bolt using a 1/2-inch drive and a 4-foot cheater pipe for leverage. Then he positioned himself and put his weight into it slowly. It wasn't a sudden jerk or a hard pull, but a gradual pressure, the way you'd lean into a fence line when you weren't entirely sure the posts would hold. The crankshaft moved. It was only a quarter turn, maybe even a little less than that before it stopped again. But the important thing was that it had moved at all. The penetrating oil had worked its way down into at least part of the bore and broken that rust bond just enough to prove the engine wasn't locked solid anymore. It was stuck. And in the world of old iron, stuck is a whole different condition than seized, because it meant the next 2 days of soaking actually had a place to go. Eli set the cheater pipe down on the grass, stood up straight, and looked at the machine for a long minute without moving a muscle. That quarter turn was the first honest thing the 1460 had said to anyone in 22 years. He found Walter in the barn at 10 o'clock that night, but the old man wasn't in the house or sitting on the porch like usual. He was sitting on an overturned feed bucket under a single buzzing work light, running a rag soaked in neatsfoot oil along a leather harness that hung from a wooden peg on the wall. The harness was old, the kind of old that tells you it hadn't been on a horse in decades, and it was being maintained the way you take care of something you can't bring yourself to use, but can't bring yourself to throw away either. Walter didn't even look up when Eli walked into the barn. He just kept working that oil into the leather with his thumb in slow circles, following the line of the stitching. Eli leaned his weight against the doorframe and watched the old man for a moment before he finally asked the question he'd been carrying since he saw that name in the manual. He asked whose harvester it really was, and Walter's thumb stopped moving right then and there. The old man looked at the leather harness instead of looking at Eli, and he stayed quiet for a long breath before he finally gave an answer. Harold Greer had bought that 1460 brand new off the dealer lot back in the spring of 1971, and he'd run it through 4 full harvests of corn and beans. He always started with the North 40 every year because that's where his father had started the farm. And Harold was the kind of man who believed in honoring the sequence of things. In October of 1975, during his 5th harvest, he'd been out working the east field all by himself when his heart finally gave out on him. He died right there in the cab, and the machine was still idling in the field when the neighbor finally found him later that day. Walter had been 59 years old at the time, and he was the one who had shut the harvester down, driven it to the hedgerow himself, and walked all the way back to the house alone. He told himself he'd deal with the machine later, once the grief had settled enough for him to think straight. But the truth was that later never actually came. The grief didn't settle so much as it just became part of the ground he walked on every day. And by the time he could think clearly about the machine, he'd realized he didn't want to. The 3 mechanics who came before hadn't been given a real chance to fix it, and Walter admitted that none of them ever stood a fair shake. With the first one, he'd let the high price end the conversation, and with the second, he used a cracked fitting as a convenient excuse to stop something that had started to feel wrong. He'd called the third man mostly because enough years had passed that he thought he might finally be ready to see it run. But he realized pretty quickly that he wasn't. He picked up the oil rag again, but didn't start rubbing the leather. He just held it there in his hand while he looked at the floor. "I kept it because I couldn't sell it," he said. "And I couldn't fix it because I didn't want anybody just fixing it." That was all he had to say on the matter, and he went back to his harness with his thumb moving in those slow circles, while the work light hummed above them, and the crickets outside ran their steady current through the dark. Eli stood there in the doorway long enough that leaving started to feel like a conscious decision rather than just something he was doing. He walked back to the hedgerow and stood next to the machine in the dark for a long while, not working on it, just letting that information settle into his bones. He understood now what he'd actually said yes to when he took the job, and he realized that fixing the iron was going to be the simple part. Day 7 was when he finally tried for a full rotation. He fit the breaker bar onto the front pulley and slid that long cheater pipe over the handle to give himself some leverage. He didn't jerk it or get impatient, but instead applied a slow, steady pressure just like he had back on day 4, letting the weight of his body build up force until the metals started to give. The engine didn't just budge a quarter turn this time. It went all the way around, the crankshaft moving through its full arc with a smooth resistance that told him nothing was binding up inside. Eli set the pipe down on the platform and just stood there in the quiet for a second, letting out one slow breath as the tension left his shoulders. That was the only moment of celebration he allowed himself, because he knew a hand-turned engine is a long way from a running one, and there were still a lot of miles to cover before this machine could breathe on its own. The fuel system was the next big hurdle on the list. That tank had been sitting with diesel in it since October of 1975, and by now the stuff coming out of the petcock wasn't even fuel anymore, but a dark and gummy paste that smelled like a mix of tar and old rubber. The hydrocarbons had long since broken down into a sludge that would have ruined the injectors instantly, So he drained every drop and flushed the tank twice with fresh fuel before replacing every single inch of the old lines. He pulled all 6 injectors one by one and dropped them into a pan of clean diesel, letting them soak overnight to see if they could be saved. 2 of them came out of the soak looking workable after some careful cleaning, but another one had a hairline fracture running right through the body that would have sprayed fuel everywhere instead of atomizing it. Since that part was junk, he had to go hunting for a replacement. He spent the afternoon on Walter's kitchen phone calling every salvage yard he could find, working his way through a trade directory he'd spotted on the shelf above the refrigerator. On the 5th call, a yard out in eastern Ohio told him they had a parts machine with 1 injector left from the right model family, so he told them to hold it and paid for 3-day freight to get it to Walter's address. When the package finally arrived, the part was wrong. It wasn't a total disaster, but the thread pitch on the body was just a 1/4 turn finer than the port where it needed to seat, making it close enough to look right, but impossible to use. He sat at the workbench, turning the metal over in his hands for a few minutes while he thought it through. Then he walked over to the shop and grabbed the tap and die set hanging on the pegboard near the lathe. It took 6 hours of grueling work to re-thread that port by hand, and he had to be incredibly careful to make sure the injector would seat tight enough to hold up under the massive pressure of the fuel system. He must have tested the fit a dozen times before he felt good about it, and by the time he was done, his hands had developed a deep ache that started in his knuckles and worked its way up to his elbows. Next, he turned his attention to the feeder house, where the chains were stretched so far they were beyond any normal adjustment. So he pulled them off and replaced the whole set. The elevator paddles were in even worse shape, having rotted right off their mounting bolts until they were just sitting loose in the housing like a pile of dead leaves. Finally, he looked at the fan assembly and saw that 2 of the 4 blades had cracked across the middle from years of freezing and thawing, which meant he had to cut new ones from a sheet of 16-gauge steel he found in the shop. He welded the new blades onto the hub and balanced the whole thing by feel, spinning it on the shaft and grinding down the heavy spots until it ran true without shaking. On the morning of day 9, he put fresh fuel in the tank and checked every connection one last time before climbing into the cab to turn the key. The engine cranked over and fired twice, sending 2 hard barks of exhaust out of the stack, but then it sputtered and went quiet again. He sat there for a minute without moving. Then he climbed back down to pull the injection pump cover so he could check the timing with a feeler gauge. It had drifted just enough to keep a cold engine from starting, so he adjusted the lead, put the cover back on, and climbed back up into the seat. On the second try, the engine actually caught and stayed running. It sounded rough for the first minute, knocking and blowing smoke like a machine that had forgotten its own purpose. But then the internals settled, and the idle dropped into a low, steady rhythm that Eli could feel vibrating through the floorboards. That sound was loud enough to carry across the entire farm and all the way to the house. Walter heard it from the kitchen. He didn't come out to look, though. Not yet. The machine stayed running all through the night. Eli let it idle for 2 hours while he watched the temperature gauge climb up to the operating range, keeping his ears open for any metallic knocks that might mean something was about to break. Nothing failed, and the thin column of white smoke coming out of the stack eventually cleared up once the water vapor burned out of the cylinders. Even though it sounded good, he knew better than to think the job was finished. There is a massive difference between a machine idling in a yard and a machine working in a field, especially since a combine will act perfectly fine until you drop the header into a stand of corn and put the whole system under a real load. To make sure it was ready, he spent the next 2 days buried in the harvesting system, checking the threshing cylinder and the cleaning shoe with the same focus a surgeon uses on a pre-op checklist. He adjusted the cylinder clearances back to the original specs, replaced 2 cracked concave sections he found, and fixed the warped sieve frames that were throwing chaff into the clean grain. Walter finally showed up on the morning of day 10. He didn't stop at the edge of the brush this time, but walked all the way through the thorns and the wild roses until he was standing right next to the machine.
He took a slow lap around the whole thing, looking at the new chains and the welded fan blades before bending down to check the air pressure in the front tires. He even looked at the cab windows, which Eli had scrubbed inside and out until the glass was actually clear again. Then, he reached out and put his bare hand flat against the engine block. He obviously knew the engine was running, but the physical warmth and the vibration moving into his palms seemed to catch him off guard anyway. It was the undeniable proof that a machine he'd spent 11 years trying to keep dead was suddenly alive again. And he stared at his hand for a second after pulling it away before shoving it deep into his pocket. He looked over at Eli and asked if he'd bothered to read the manual. Eli told him he had. "Whose name is written in the front cover?" Walter asked. "Harold Greer," Eli answered. Walter just gave a single nod, and a look crossed his face that sat somewhere right between grief and relief. He took one last look at the old iron, then he told Eli it was time to take the machine out and see what it could actually do. The south edge of the east field still had a strip of standing corn that Eli had purposely left unharvested for this exact moment. He climbed into the cab, lowered the header, and steered the 1460 straight into the rows. Walter didn't stay on the ground, but instead climbed up to ride on the fender. That isn't a safe place for anyone to be while a combine is running. But Eli knew that was exactly where the old man needed to be, so he didn't say a word about it. Walter just stood there on the step plate, with his hand on the rail, watching the header pull the stalks into the machine. The old combine actually worked. It was losing more grain out the back than a modern machine would, mostly because the cleaning shoe wasn't perfect, but it was performing exactly the way it was designed to back in 1971. Walter had spent enough of his life behind the wheel of this equipment to know the difference between a machine that was failing and one that was just being honest. He stayed on that fender for the entire pass and didn't say a single word until they hit the end of the row and Eli lifted the header. He just looked at the field and said, "All right." That was the end of it for the moment. The deed didn't get signed that day, though. Walter still had one more thing he needed to settle before he was ready to let go. They walked the boundary the next morning, just the two of them, on foot. Walter led the way along the edge of the field with that unhurried gait of his, reading the ground rather than just crossing it. But there was something different in how he carried himself out here. He seemed looser, like a man who had been holding his breath for a long time and finally decided to let part of it go. When he reached the first corner post, he stopped and crouched down to work 2 fingers into the soil at the base of the wood. The earth was dark and heavy, the kind of dirt that holds on to moisture for 3 days after a rain and only gives it back slow. He rubbed the soil between his fingers before standing up and moving on without saying a word, and Eli followed behind and waited for him to speak. At the second corner post, Walter finally started talking. His grandfather, a man named Edwin, had broken this ground back in 1919 with a 2-bottom plow and a team of horses. Edwin bought the parcel with money he'd saved over 11 years of tenant farming, paying $40 an acre, and he signed the papers at a bank in Crawfordsville on a Tuesday morning in March. He had walked the boundary that same afternoon alone, in mud up to his ankles, and he drove a stake at each corner with his own hands. Those stakes were long gone, but the posts Walter touched every morning on his fence-line walk were sunk within a foot of where Edwin had originally driven them. The Depression took ground all around them, and the droughts in the 1930s took even more. In 1982, a bank in Indianapolis tried to call a note on the property during the farm crisis, so Walter drove 3 hours to sit across a desk from a man half his age. He explained, without ever raising his voice, that the North 40 was not part of any conversation involving a bank, and it hadn't been then, and it wasn't now. 4 generations held this, Walter said, looking at the field instead of at Eli. Not because it was easy, but because nobody who had it was willing to be the one who lost it. He turned then and looked at Eli directly, which was not something Walter Greer did casually. "I'm not giving you land," he said. "I'm asking you to carry something, and that's a different proposition." He laid out the condition plainly.
The deed would transfer with Eli's name on the title, but Walter would keep a life estate. This gave him the right to live on the property and farm it alongside Eli until he was gone. Eli would have to farm the North 40 the way it was meant to be farmed, not like a man looking to sell, but like a man who intends to hand it down.
Eli stood at the third corner post and understood, finally and completely, why the wager had been what it was. Walter hadn't actually needed the machine fixed, but he'd needed to find out if Eli was the kind of man who could look at something old and broken and understand that its value had nothing to do with what it would cost to replace it. The three mechanics had each answered that question in their own way, and every one of those answers had been wrong. Eli had answered it differently. He didn't do it by being smarter or better equipped, but by reading the name on the inside cover of a manual and understanding what it meant for that name to be there. He said yes to the condition, and Walter gave him a single nod. They signed the deed that afternoon at the kitchen table, while Walter's neighbor Ruth watched as a witness. She was a small woman in her late 60s who had known Walter since before his wife passed away, and she cried quietly into a dish towel while he signed his name.
Walter didn't acknowledge the crying, but he just slid the pen across the table to Eli. Then he got up, opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, and came back with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. He poured them both without asking, and slid one across the table without a word. Eli picked it up. He didn't park it back in the hedgerow. That was the first decision he made, and it wasn't a complicated one. The blackberry vines and the wild rose had held the 1460 for 22 years, and that was long enough for any machine to sit in the weeds. He drove it to the main equipment barn, pulled the Case 1480 forward to make room, and backed the old IH into the empty bay on the north side. It was the widest one with the highest ceiling clearance, a bay that had sat unused for as long as anyone on the property could remember. Over the next 3 days, he cleaned it properly. This wasn't the mechanical cleaning he'd done to make it run, but the other kind that takes time and isn't strictly necessary. It's the truest measure of how seriously you take something. He pulled the cab apart to wipe down every surface, and he replaced the cracked seat cushion with foam and vinyl he cut himself. He wire brushed the worst of the surface rust off the sheet metal and shot it with a coat of primer to keep the weather off. He didn't repaint it red, but left it the color it had become, because some things earn their age honestly, and covering it up would have been a lie. Then he cut a piece of oak from a board he found drying in the corner of the shop. It was 3 feet long and 6 inches wide, and after he sanded the face smooth, he stenciled 4 words on it in black paint. Harold Greer, 1971. He hung it above the bay on 2 finish nails, centered over the machine, and he stepped back to look at it for a moment before he went to bed. Walter found it 3 days later. Eli was working the east field when he looked back toward the barn and saw the big door standing open, with Walter's silhouette inside, standing perfectly still. He stayed there a long time, long enough that Eli made a full pass and came back around to find Walter still standing in the same spot. He never said anything about it to Eli, and Eli never asked. The following fall, they ran the 1460 on the North 40. It wasn't the primary machine, since the Case handled the bulk of the harvest, but every acre of that original homestead ground went through Harold Greer's combine. Eli drove it while Walter stood in the barn doorway watching, and they did it the second year too. By the third year, it was simply how the North 40 got harvested, the same way the corner posts got touched every morning. Sequence was honored, and the method was respected. Walter knew things about that ground that weren't in any book. He knew where the hardpan ran shallow along the western edge, and which rows drained slow after a heavy rain. He told Eli these things in the same flat, spare way he told everything, saying it once without repeating himself because he expected it to stick. It stuck. The land taught Eli the rest the same way the machine had, not through instruction, but through resistance. It taught him through the places it pushed back and made him figure out why. By the second season, He'd stopped needing to be told where to start. Walter never sat Eli down to tell him he'd earned his place. He didn't have to. He just stopped referring to him as the Hand. And in this part of the country, that silence spoke louder than any speech ever could. Some of the most important truths in life don't get said out loud. They just get lived out in the dirt and the heat. If you want to hear more stories about the land, the legacies we leave behind, and the people stubborn enough to hold on to both, go ahead and subscribe. There are plenty more where this one came from. There is a specific brand of stubbornness that people often mistake for something else. From a distance, it looks like patience, or maybe just a man who has nowhere better to be and all the time in the world to get there. That was Eli during those first few weeks on the North 40 after the deed was signed. He wasn't out there celebrating or acting like he'd won a prize. He was just working the ground the way the ground needed to be worked. He spent his days learning the habits of that soil the same way you learn the habits of a person, by paying close enough attention that the hidden patterns finally start to show themselves. Mistakes happened, because mistakes are just part of the tuition you pay to the land. On the western edge, right where Walter had warned him the hardpan ran shallow, Eli ran the chisel plow through in the early spring at full depth. He felt the steel implement bounce off something solid about 6 inches down, exactly where Walter said it would be, and he had to back off the depth and make a second pass to get it right. Walter was standing by the fence line watching the whole thing that morning, but he didn't say a word when Eli came in for dinner later that day. He didn't need to say anything, because the dirt had already told the story. That was the real education for Eli. It wasn't about the part where he fixed the machine, because mechanical work has a certain logic to it that makes sense if you have a wrench and some time. You find a problem, you pick a method, and you reach a solution. The land doesn't care about logic, and it presents the same difficult questions year after year while changing the answers based on things you can't control. Rainfall timing, a sudden shift in temperature, or the way one wet spring moves the drainage in a low corner can change everything. Walter had spent 50 years learning how to read those subtle shifts, and Eli was smart enough to know that having the deed didn't mean he had the understanding yet. He started carrying a small, spiral-bound notebook in the cab of the 1460 Combine. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place to scratch down the things Walter told him about specific rows or how certain corners behaved when the weather turned sour. He wrote down what he saw with his own eyes, and after 2 full seasons, that first notebook was plumb full of observations. When he started the second one, Walter noticed it the way he noticed most things on the farm. He didn't make a comment, but he watched with that particular quality of attention that meant he'd registered the effort and filed it away as something that mattered. By the time the third fall rolled around, the old man was starting to slow down. It wasn't a dramatic change that announced itself with a bang. It was more like a strong machine that had been run hard for too many years. The tolerances had opened up, and it just cost him a little more energy to do the same work he used to do without thinking. He still made his way to the fence line every morning to touch the corner posts, but he started letting Eli make more of the big field decisions without looking over his shoulder. Some evenings, Walter would just sit on the porch after supper instead of heading back out to the shed, which was something Eli had never seen him do in all the years they'd worked together. Eli saw the change and adjusted his own routine without making a big production out of it. He took on more of the heavy lifting and started asking his questions earlier in the day before Walter had used up his store of energy. He made sure the North 40 was always the field he could account for down to the inch, because he knew that was the one Walter was going to ask about first. Walter always asked, right up until the season came when he couldn't walk the full length of the fence line anymore. He asked about the North 40 because that was where Harold Greer had always started his work, and in Walter's mind, starting there was the only way to honor the sequence of the seasons. Eli always gave him an honest answer without softening the bad news or trying to make the good news sound better than it was. He learned that kind of directness from the man sitting across from him. There is a photograph tucked away somewhere that Ruth took during that third autumn. Neither man knew she was there, so neither one of them is posing for the camera.
Walter is sitting on the porch steps, and Eli is standing in the yard just below him. And both of them are looking out toward the north field.
You can see the 1460 working the last few rows of the season in that long, golden afternoon light. They are just two men watching a machine turn over ground that has been held by the same family for 4 generations, and they both knew it was now being held for the 5th. The machine ran clean and the rows stayed straight, just like they were supposed to. It turns out that if you are patient enough and honest about the cost, some things can actually be brought back.